Hello everyone. Welcome back to my Form 5 ethics class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. In this video, we're going to take a look at question 6, article 8, the last article in the question, where Aquinas tackles ignorance and how it impacts voluntariness. So the question, same format of the last few articles, whether ignorance causes involuntariness. For this one, the challenge is we have a very long respondio and no replies to objections because the respondio directly deals with the issues raised in all three objections. So what we're trying to learn here are the three kinds of ignorance that Aquinas brings up: concomitant, consequent, and antecedent. You need to be able to not only define them, but distinguish them from each other and see where each one shows up, not only in the respondio, but how the respondio parts line up with the objections. His order of presentation in the response does not follow the order of presentation of the objections. The other big issue is all the ideas that we've used since the beginning of Article 1. They're all in play here. This is a really nice summary article for the question. So you'll see lots of Article 1 and 3 and 5 and 6 and 7 and so on. And at this point, hopefully, it's becoming old hat. In the last few articles, we've been asking what happens with voluntariness when we have breakdowns at the S level, when we have an S reaction to an object, whether positive or negative. But now, since we've been talking about knowledge of the end the whole time, since the very beginning of the article, well, seems reasonable now to ask what happens if things break down in I, where knowledge of the end resides. If ignorance is a defect of the intellect, then seems like it should cause involuntariness somehow. It should take away the voluntary act. The three objectors are pretty simple, I think. You have some tricks, though. You're going to need to see how they line up with the respondio eventually. That part's a little bit harder. And you need to be able to see in hindsight then which forms of ignorance are being discussed. All three objections are saying true things. It's a perfect example of objections being exactly right, but too narrow, only giving you part of the story. They are essentially taking one form of ignorance that Aquinas wants to talk about and applying things said of one of them to all of them. And that's the part you'll disentangle on your own when the article's finished. The first objection, it would seem that ignorance does not cause involuntariness, for the involuntary act deserves pardon, as Damascene says. Hopefully you recognize that, since that's the sed contra of Article 7, the first part of it. But sometimes that which is done through ignorance does not deserve pardon, which was again what the sed contra in Article 7 was about, although we were talking about something else there. According to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 38, if any man know not, he shall not be known. Therefore, ignorance does not cause involuntariness. If you've seen my video on how to read an article of the Summa, this first little point I've made here will be familiar to you. Don't worry about the scriptural citation. We can get that out of there and replace it with any kind of intuitive appeal. This is an easy example of getting bogged down debating whether or not that's a good translation of 1 Corinthians chapter 14, and is that what St. Paul was really talking about in his first letter to the Corinthians, and none of that matters. What matters is sometimes when people say, I didn't know, we still hold them accountable for what they did. That's all the objection is claiming. We shouldn't blame people for involuntary acts. We don't, or when we do, we're doing something wrong when we do. It's irrational to do so. But we do sometimes blame them for acts done out of ignorance. That's the objection. Once you get down into the respondio, you should be able to see that we're confusing antecedent and consequent ignorance here. Objection 2, again, with a scriptural citation, every sin implies ignorance. According to Proverbs 14:22, they err that work evil. If therefore ignorance causes involuntariness, it would follow every sin is involuntary, which is opposed to the saying of Augustine that every sin is voluntary. So again, we don't need the citation. In fact, you could easily swap in anything by Aristotle or Plato. Obviously, for Aquinas, it's a stronger objection if it's scriptural, since the authority there is omniscient and can't lie. But this is a classic way for the Greeks to talk about sin as well. Every sin involves ignorance. It's some kind of error, mental error. If you had really known something, you wouldn't have done it. If you had really known it was bad for you. if you had really known what's good for you, you could in some way reduce any sin to ignorance of some kind. This is what St. Augustine's actually responding to, his reading of Plato on this exact point when he goes into the story of the pears and his horrifying realization that he didn't do it out of ignorance, but rather out of concupiscence for malice. But still, we can endorse the idea that every sin involves some kind of ignorance. That's fine. Scripture has it too. The problem is, if every sin involves ignorance, and ignorance causes involuntariness, then every sin is involuntary. That's meant to be a reductio ad absurdum. We don't even need the authority of Augustine for this. We're going to go on to prove over the next, or discuss over the next several parts of the Summa what a sin is. And a sin, by definition, is a voluntary action, an evil voluntary action. So you can't have an involuntary voluntary action. We don't say that involuntary sin, not in this ethical system. It doesn't mean anything. You would have to focus exclusively on things done and be totally indifferent to whether or not they're voluntary, and we don't do that. Again, this objection, like the first one, is confusing consequent and antecedent ignorance, just in a different way. The third objection is a little different. Further, involuntariness is not without sadness, as Damascene says, which again is from Article 7. That's the grief component of the sed contra in Article 7. But some things are done out of ignorance, but without sadness. For instance, and a slightly strange story here, a man may kill a foe whom he wished to kill, but thinking at the time that he's killing a stag. Therefore, ignorance does not cause involuntariness. Well, as we've said a lot recently in the last few videos, Question 6, Article 5 is where we first started talking a lot about sadness or grief at what is done as part of the involuntary. That's part of what it means for an action to be involuntary. It's contrary to your will. You don't want it. So if it happens, you're sad. Well, sometimes we act out of ignorance, but we aren't sad at the outcome. We like the outcome. Works out great for us. He gives the example of a hunter who he's out hunting and he kills what he thinks is a stag, but either he misses and hits someone that he didn't know was there, but it turns out it's his mortal enemy and he's really glad they're dead. Or perhaps it wasn't never a stag and he got very lucky killing someone who was trying to kill him. But you can make the example a lot less strange than killing someone on accident, although sadly such things happen, I guess. But we could have smaller examples too. They don't always have to be murder examples. Perhaps we could do some of those in class. But the key is, the thing worked out. We were ignorant, but one of those essential elements of involuntariness isn't there. It's not contrary to our will, so we're not sad about it. This one is the concomitant ignorance that Aquinas is going to talk about coming up. That means that all three objections are interested in saying that ignorance causes involuntariness, that the things that we do out of ignorance are involuntary. That's quite a remarkable position to end up in. If you are ignorant, then in every case of ignorance, you are not responsible for what you've done. It's a pretty, seems strange, I think. But how does Aquinas solve this? Sed contra, Damascene and the philosopher. What is done through ignorance is involuntary. This is a great example of a sed contra that is not the answer, as is one of my rules, right, in the how to read an article of the Summa. This is clearly just going in the other direction of the objectors. What is done through ignorance is involuntary, is focusing on a particular form of ignorance in the same way that the objectors were focusing on a particular form of ignorance, and then applying it to all the rest. We've just picked a different one here. You look ahead to the respondio and you tell me what kind of ignorance this is. This is easy to come back to and answer on your own. Respondio. And this is a big respondio, so we're going to break this one down. First, this opening sentence, the Latin is a little bit strange here. And I'm going to make an interpretive move. We're not going to spend too long trying to talk about what's going on in the Latin in the first and second sentence and the English translation and all that. We can make that a fun game outside of this video. I don't want to hash it all out here. But I'm going to add a word. And I'm going to reword slightly the translation that I've given you in class. So here's how I'm going to read the first sentence. Ignorance causes involuntariness insofar as it deprives one of that knowledge which is a necessary condition of voluntariness, as was declared above. That would be Article 1. But it's not every ignorance that deprives one of this knowledge. I've essentially borrowed the this from the second sentence, which Aquinas does use, knowledge of this kind, huius modi. And I've applied it in reverse to the first sentence as well, to try to clarify, to try to smooth something out that I think Aquinas left a little awkward. The second sentence is the key. Some ignorance deprives one of the knowledge of the end that's a necessary condition of voluntariness. Some does not. And that, of course, is a distinction. So it's time to make the distinction. New kind, though, threefold, a triplex distinction. Accordingly, we must take note that ignorance has a threefold relationship to the act of the will. And now we get our fancy terms. In one way, concomitantly. In another way, consequently. And in a third way, antecedently. The challenge here is to define those three and then make a diagram, some kind of tree, a Porphyrian tree. Can you take this long respondio, which is explaining these three, and show how they're related to each other? And we're going to give you one of these in a minute. But it's definitely an exercise you should try on your own. If you know enough English and Latin, the terms, concomitant, consequent, and antecedent, they contain within them their identities a little bit. They really do reveal to you what's going on. They tell you something important. They're descriptive. Concomitant literally means something like to run along with. So a concomitant ignorance is one that runs alongside of or with the act of the will. Consequent ignorance follows the will somehow. It's an ignorance that follows upon an act of the will. And antecedent means that it falls before an act of the will, comes first, it's prior. So let's see how these work. Here's my tree, and I'm just going to keep the Porphyrian tree running down the right-hand side the whole time, and I'm going to put text on the left with some explanation. This Porphyrian tree is trying to stay as faithful to the way Aquinas presents it, his order of presentation in the Respondio. When we're done, I'm going to show you a different Porphyrian tree, which does not follow his order of presentation, but which I think it's inspired by something he says later, and possibly is an easier way to think about it. Possibly. Maybe not. So the first way we can divide up ignorance is by asking whether or not ignorance is causally related to the act of the will or not. And by causally related, I mean, is it a cause or an effect? If there's a causal relation between the ignorance and the act of the will, then we'll go look at that in a second on the lower branch. But if there's not, then we have our first kind of ignorance, concomitant ignorance. Concomitant ignorance is the kind that is not related as cause or effect to the act of the will. But it is related to what is done, just not the act of the will. So concomitant is when there is ignorance of what is done, but even if you had known, you would have done it anyway. Even if it were known, it would still be done. Because in this case, ignorance does not induce one to wish this to be done, because there's no act of the will. It just so happens that a thing is at the same time done and not known. Thus, in the example given above, in Objection 3, a man did want to kill his foe, but he killed him in ignorance, thinking he was killing a stag. Ignorance of this kind, as the philosopher states, does not cause involuntariness because it's not the cause of anything that is repugnant to the will, which is an essential element of the involuntary, right? You have to be unhappy with the outcome. But here, with concomitant ignorance, we like the outcome. We would have done it. We would have willed it if we had known. So this one causes non-voluntariness, which we first introduced back in Article 3, and I told you would be important for this very point. Because what is not known can't be willed. So there's this previous act of the will where I want to kill this guy. But in this moment of hunting, I think I'm killing a stag. Turns out, accidentally, quite unknown to me, I've killed my foe. I can't call it voluntary because I didn't know what I was doing. I can't call it involuntary because I'm really happy with the outcome. And it's because the ignorance and the voluntary act run alongside of each other. They just happen to coincide. There's no causal connection between them. That's concomitant. Now we can look at ignorance that is causally related to the act of the will. And that causal connection can either be, it can be the cause of the act of the will, or it can be an effect of the act of the will. So what we'll start with is effect. When we have an ignorance that is an effect of the act of the will, it is itself caused by an act of the will. And this is what is called consequent ignorance. This is his longest treatment in the Respondio. It's a very long block of text. He makes a distinction here. I've omitted all of that content for this slide. I've just got the first lines and the final lines. And then we'll go back and we'll look a little bit at the content in between. Ignorance is consequent to the act of the will, follows it, insofar as ignorance itself is voluntary. You could just call this voluntary ignorance or willed ignorance. And this can happen in two ways in accordance with the aforesaid modes of voluntary, which is again Article 3. We're going to skip what that is for a second. Hopefully you already know. And then we'll come back to his conclusion. Accordingly, if in either of these ways ignorance is voluntary, it cannot cause involuntariness. Not simply, at any rate. It does cause involuntariness in a certain respect. So you can see a little bit of the fear article there, that language from Article 6. Inasmuch as our act of it precedes a movement of the will toward an act, which movement wouldn't exist if there were knowledge. So you might not have done it if you'd known, but you're responsible for the not knowing. So you're also responsible for the doing or not doing. Yeah. We'll clean that up on a summary, perhaps, if that's a little bit unclear. What are these two ways that ignorance can be willed? Hopefully you remember directly and indirectly. Right? How does ignorance arise from within us? That's what we're asking. How is the ignorance our fault, our responsibility? Well, we could directly will not to know something, right? But we could also indirectly will not to know something, where we could have learned, should have learned, and didn't. Something like an ignorance of negligence. I'm going to put the text of these of the consequent ignorance section on the screen, but I don't want to read through it too fast. First, he talks about the ignorance that is actively willed. It's directly willed. When we want an excuse, he gives the example of sin, in a cosmic sense, but it could just as easily be, I'm not going to read the student handbook so that I can say, well, I didn't know the rules. This is where you're playing games with the rules, with your parent, with the teachers, with the police, with whoever, right? And perhaps indeed with God in the cosmic sense, as we have here. We affect ignorance. Yeah, I don't want to know the answer, because if I know the answer, I'm going to have to do something about it, and I don't want to do something about it. That's directly willed ignorance. The other kind, probably the more common kind, is when we don't know something, but we could have known it, we should have known it, and we neglected to learn it for some reason or another. He actually makes another distinction in here, so there's a lot of nested distinctions in this part of the text. But fundamentally, we have indirectly willed ignorance, something that arises from our failure to do what we should have done, an ignorance that is due to negligence of some kind. That's consequent ignorance. Since the ignorance is willed, the action, the willing that comes from the ignorance, or the action that comes from the ignorance, is also willed in a sort of derivative sense. Say we're responsible for it. Now, the final kind, which is quite briefly handled at the end, so if you're skimming and you get lost in the ocean of distinctions of consequent ignorance, you might actually not realize that we're talking about the third and final kind. Students make this mistake all the time. Please study more carefully. Please read. Ignorance is antecedent when the ignorance is the cause of the act of the will. We only willed it something because we were ignorant. It caused it. So our act of the will is the effect. This is the kind that causes involuntariness, simply. Ignorance is antecedent to the act of the will when it's not voluntary, and it is the cause of our willing what we would not have willed otherwise. So you actually have to compare it to the other kinds of ignorance, both consequent and concomitant, to see what this one is. Concomitant, we would have willed it anyway. So in that sense, antecedent is quite different. We would not have willed it. We are saddened at the outcome. If we had known, if we'd really known, we wouldn't have done it. It's different from consequent in that the fact that we're ignorant, it's not our fault. It didn't arise out of any negligence or failure to consider the things that should have been considered. We did the things we should have done. We knew the things we should have known. We could not reasonably have known this. Antecedent is a little bit of a harder one to pin down, perhaps, because you are dealing with hypotheticals. Same with concomitant, actually. There's a hypothetical involved in them. But this is the kind that excuses. This is the kind that makes your action involuntary, so that what you do is not held against you. He alters the example of in the objection, the third objection of shooting the stag. He changes it to a different kind of shooting story, where a person takes proper precautions and isn't negligent in any way, and ends up shooting someone because they go across his field of fire. Now, his example of shooting arrows along the road 750 years ago probably doesn't translate so well. So maybe we need a slightly more modernized example here. Some terrible accident at a shooting range, perhaps. Who knows? But the essential elements here are you would not have willed it if you had known. And the fact that you didn't know is not your fault. And that kind of ignorance does cause involuntariness. That's the kind that excuses. So the quick summary here, concomitant ignorance is not willed. You didn't will the ignorance. The action's not willed either, but you would have willed it because you like the outcome. So in the story of the man hunting and accidentally killing his enemy, if it were the case that he'd seen it was his enemy, he would have shot him anyway. That's concomitant ignorance. This action is non-voluntary because what is not willed cannot be known. What is not known cannot be willed. Sorry about that. Consequent ignorance is probably the easiest one to state. It's ignorance that you've willed, either directly or indirectly. And the action that results is also willed. It's voluntary because the ignorance is willed. You are responsible for the things that you do as a result of consequent ignorance, because the fact that you don't know is your fault. It's on you. Antecedent ignorance is where the ignorance was not willed, and you would not have willed the action if you had known. It's not willed directly, and it's also not willed indirectly. It's not willed in any sense. And you never would have willed the action if you had known. And this is the kind that leads to involuntary action. And with that summary, then you can roll back through the objections and see which kind of ignorance the objector is talking about, or which two types he's confusing, or for that matter, for the sed contra. Right? Hopefully you know that the sed contra is talking about antecedent ignorance. Now, I did want to show one other way to draw the tree, in part because of some other things that Aquinas does with this later, also in part because of something he says about antecedent ignorance on this slide. The way he starts to describe it, it's actually a little bit different than the way he set up the original presentation. So you could actually start by asking of ignorance, how does it arise? Is it willed or is it not willed? And that question is going to give you a different kind of tree. If it's willed, then you're going to get one kind of ignorance. And if it's not willed, we can ask another question and subdivide that into the other two kinds. In a second, I'm going to show you what the three are, but hopefully if you have read the article and understood it and followed this video, you should be able to supply for yourself the names of the ignorance on this diagram. The second question is, does what is done cause grief? Was it contrary to your will? Are you happy with the outcome? In some cases, an ignorance that we didn't will gives rise to a thing that causes grief. It's counter to our will. That's one kind of ignorance. In other cases, the ignorance that's not willed gives rise to something that is not counter to our will and that we're quite happy with. Thank you very much. Hopefully nothing so grave as killing a person. So hopefully you can see what the three kinds are. I think this is just another way to reverse the order of presentation, but if you really need me to show you, here are the answers. Consequent is the willed kind of ignorance, and among unwilled or not willed ignorances, we have concomitant and antecedent. And actually on this diagram, the difference between concomitant and antecedent again goes back to Article 3, where we have something that's just not willed at all, and something that is, in fact, contrary to the will. So concomitant is non-voluntary, and antecedent is involuntary, the two different ways you could negate voluntary or negate willed. Two different kinds of negatives. And of course, consequent ignorance is just willed. It is voluntary. And now you should be able to synthesize what's going on in the objections and the sed contra. And hopefully, all of the question, because this is it. Not only is this the end of Article 8, this is the end of all of question 6. We've now seen our first basic look at what does it mean for action to come from within. What is a voluntary action? What does it mean for us to be responsible for action? And what are the limits of that responsibility? What are the limits of voluntariness? Where does it break down? What are the kinds of things we should be looking at? We've certainly not answered every question, but this is a really good starting point for the things that we're going to do for the rest of the semester. And you need to know question 6 very well in order to not get hopelessly tangled when we go on to practical reason and the evaluation of acts as good or evil. Because we do still have a lot to say about how the intellect works and the different kinds of acts of the will in our account of practical reason. That's where we're going to go next. But for now, let's sit back and enjoy our success. We'll start a new series with the next videos. If you've got any questions about this video or anything in question 6, you know how to get a hold of me. Comment down below. And otherwise, I'll see you in class. Good luck. God bless.